He stood beside a wrecked car on a dark mountain road, and he did not scream. He did not shake. He did not run for help. His wife was unconscious a few feet away from him, bleeding into the passenger seat, and he simply stood there, phone in his pocket, doing nothing, until a total stranger pulled over and asked him the one question he should never have needed to be asked. "Have you called 911? He said no. 9 years before that night, this same man told police a very different story. He said he had gone out for a jog, and when he came home, he found his first wife dying at the bottom of the basement stairs. 2 wives. 2 so-called accidents, separated by almost a decade, and in both cases the same man standing calmly in the wreckage, untouched, unshaken, and strangely composed. This is the story of Arthur Schirmer, a small-town pastor who spent more than 30 years building a reputation for gentleness, warmth, and quiet moral authority, and then used every ounce of that trust to walk away from the deaths of 2 women who loved him. Welcome to Buried Truth Crime. Stick with us to the end, because the forensic detail that finally cracked this case is one of the coldest, most calculated mistakes we have ever covered. Arthur Burton Schirmer was born on the 1st of May, 1948, in the small town of Milton, Delaware. Almost nothing is publicly known about his early childhood, but by the time he reached college, 2 things had already begun shaping the man he would become: faith and music. He studied at Eastern Pilgrim College in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and later continued at Messiah College in Grantham. It was there that he met a young woman named Jewel Bainey. Jewel had been born on the 30th of October, 1948, into a family deeply rooted in ministry. Church life was not new to her. It was simply home. Arthur and Jewel married around 1968, when they were both about 20 years old. They would go on to raise 3 children together: Amy, Julie, and Micah. Arthur was ordained as a United Methodist pastor, and for the decades that followed, he and Jewel built their entire adult lives around the church. By the late 1970s, they were serving congregations in Lancaster County, before eventually settling permanently in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, where Arthur became pastor of Bethany United Methodist Church, a position he would hold for more than 20 years. He was never just a name printed on a bulletin. He preached every single Sunday, counseled couples through failing marriages, and sang from the front of the sanctuary. Jewel sang too. She became an elementary school music teacher, the church organist, and the director of the junior choir. For years, they performed together in front of a congregation that genuinely adored them. People who knew Arthur during this period almost always reached for the same words: magnetic, calm, reassuring. The kind of man people trusted the moment he opened his mouth. Years later, a Monroe County prosecutor would describe that same magnetism as one of the most dangerous tools Arthur Schirmer ever had, not because it made him persuasive behind a pulpit, but because it made entire communities believe that whatever tragedy happened around him must simply be misfortune. Nobody investigates a beloved pastor the way they investigate an ordinary man. That trust would become the most valuable weapon in his life. But behind the sermons and the harmonies, the marriage was already quietly falling apart. Jewel's brother later said that she had confided in him about Arthur's infidelity, that Arthur had grown close to women inside his own congregation, while he was still very much a married man. If this is already unsettling you, stay close, because the story only gets darker from here. On the 23rd of April, 1999, Arthur told police a simple, almost forgettable story. He said he had gone out for a jog. When he returned to the parsonage, he found Jewel at the bottom of the basement stairs, severely injured. She had apparently been vacuuming, and the cord of the shop vac was resting near her leg, a small detail that seemed to support the idea that she had simply tripped and fallen. She was surrounded by a large amount of blood. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, but the injuries were too severe. Arthur Schirmer died the following day, on the 24th of April, 1999, at the age of 50. Her family was uneasy almost immediately. Her brother said she looked like she had been beaten, not like she had tumbled down a flight of stairs. An autopsy was performed by forensic pathologist Dr. Wayne Ross. What he found did not match a simple household accident. The trauma was concentrated almost entirely on her head and face, without the rib, pelvis, or limb injuries you would expect from an actual fall down a staircase. Dr. Ross could not confirm any underlying heart condition that might explain a sudden collapse, and he classified her manner of death as undetermined rather than accidental. He recommended further investigation. That recommendation went nowhere. Jewel's death was never treated as a possible homicide. The parsonage was never processed as a crime scene. Nobody searched for a weapon. Nobody seriously questioned Arthur's account of his morning jog. The story simply became accepted fact, and Arthur Schirmer's life continued exactly as it had before. He kept preaching. 2 years later, in 2001, he met a woman named Betty Jean Novak. Betty was born on the 28th of June, 1952, in Hershey, Pennsylvania, one of 9 children in a large family. She had been married once before and divorced, and from that earlier marriage she had a son named Nathaniel, known to everyone simply as Nate. Everyone who knew Betty described her without hesitation as warm and affectionate, a woman known for her wide smile and for the hugs she gave every single Sunday at church. On the 2nd of June, 2001, Betty married Arthur Schirmer. That same year, Arthur took over as pastor of Readers United Methodist Church in Jackson Township, deep in the Pocono Mountains. Betty moved into the parsonage beside the church, and for the second time in his life, Arthur had a wife who built her entire identity around his ministry. Betty threw herself into that role completely. She taught Sunday school. She personally greeted every member of the congregation. She joined a local charity board that helped struggling families with food and clothing. She became a devoted stepmother to Arthur's 3 adult children, and a step-grandmother to 5 grandchildren, treated no differently than blood family. But the people closest to Betty also knew small, specific details about her that would matter enormously later. She always wore her seatbelt. She never left home without her purse, and she was firmly, openly against cremation. Meanwhile, Arthur's second marriage was quietly following the exact same pattern as his first. He hired a church assistant named Cindy Musanti, whose husband Joseph was a carpenter and a member of the congregation Arthur himself had personally counseled through marital struggles. Despite that trust, and while Betty was still very much alive, Arthur began an affair with Cindy. By the summer of 2008, that affair was fully underway, hidden from almost everyone around them. Betty had no idea her 7-year marriage was already ending in someone else's mind. She kept teaching Sunday school. She kept hugging her congregation every single week. In the early hours of the 15th of July, 2008, Betty complained of pain in her jaw. Arthur said he decided to drive her to the hospital. A short distance from the parsonage, their car left the road and came to rest near a guardrail. Arthur's account was dramatic. He said he had been driving between 45 and 55 miles an hour when a deer suddenly ran into the road. He swerved, lost control, and crashed. He said Betty had not been wearing her seatbelt and had been thrown violently around inside the car. Arthur himself walked away without a scratch. A passing driver stopped when he saw the wreck. He found Betty unconscious and covered in blood, and Arthur standing nearby, calm, uninjured, holding a phone he had not used. When the stranger asked if he had called for help, Arthur said no. The stranger made the call himself and would later describe Arthur as strangely indifferent. Not panicked, not desperate, simply present. Betty was airlifted to the hospital with catastrophic head injuries, including skull fractures and bleeding inside her skull. She never regained consciousness. She died shortly after midnight on the 16th of July, 2008, at the age of 56. At the time, nobody suspected murder. There was a crashed car, a grieving pastor, and a wife with devastating injuries. The parsonage garage was never searched. No autopsy was performed, because Arthur pushed for Betty to be cremated almost immediately, despite everyone around her knowing she had always been against it. Her memorial was held just days later, still described by everyone present as the aftermath of a tragic accident. 3 months later, on the 29th of October, 2008, a second tragedy struck. Joseph Musante, the carpenter whose wife had been having an affair with Arthur, broke into the church at night, sat down at a desk he had built with his own hands, and took his own life. He had just learned the truth about his wife and the pastor he trusted. Investigators would later conclude Joseph's death was genuinely self-inflicted. But the location, inside Arthur's own office, forced the affair into public view. That exposure reached Joseph's sister, who learned in a single conversation that Cindy had been in love with Arthur, that Arthur's second wife had died only 3 months earlier, and that his first wife had died in an eerily similar accident 9 years before that. 3 deaths and 1 man at the center of all of them felt like far too much coincidence to ignore. She pushed church officials and law enforcement to look closer, and her persistence worked. In December 2008, investigators searched the church and the parsonage. In the garage, they found visible drops of blood even before running any chemical tests. A specialized blood detection test revealed a trail leading directly from the rear of the garage toward the exact spot where the passenger side of the car had been parked. Laboratory testing confirmed the blood belonged to Betty. Arthur was brought in for questioning. At first, he denied that Betty had ever bled inside the garage at all. Only after investigators showed him the physical evidence did he change his story, claiming that a pile of firewood had fallen and cut Betty's arm while they were stacking it together. Detectives went and found that exact wood pile. Underneath it were newspapers dated 2 months after Betty had already died. The story could not possibly be true. Investigators also went back and re-examined the crash itself. The car had suffered only minor damage. The airbags never deployed. There were no meaningful skid marks. Reconstruction placed the actual speed of the vehicle at somewhere between 15 and 25 miles an hour, roughly a third of what Arthur had described. Coins sitting on the center console remained almost completely undisturbed, which made little sense for a car that had supposedly spun out of control. And the blood inside the vehicle had soaked deep into the seat cushion beneath Betty, consistent with her already bleeding heavily before she was ever placed inside the car. With the case building in Monroe County, detectives reached out to authorities back in Lebanon County about Jewel's death 9 years earlier. Forensic engineers built a biomechanical simulation using a weighted dummy to recreate a fall down the exact staircase where Jewel had died. The simulation could not reproduce the pattern of injuries found on her head. Dr. Wayne Ross, the same pathologist from her original autopsy, reviewed both cases side by side and found the wound pattern strikingly similar in both women. Multiple impacts concentrated on the head, consistent with a long cylindrical object. Not a fall and not a car crash. Jewel's death was reclassified from undetermined to homicide. Stay with us, because the trial itself is about to turn into one of the most quietly devastating courtroom moments in true crime history. In the summer of 2010, the investigation gained sudden urgency. Cindy Musante told her own daughter that Arthur had bought her a ring. Terrified that her mother might become Arthur's third wife, the daughter immediately contacted police. Detectives later admitted they genuinely feared for Cindy's safety. Weeks after that engagement in September 2010, Arthur Schirmer was arrested and charged with criminal homicide and evidence tampering in Betty's death. 2 years later, in September 2012, he was formally charged in connection with Jules' death as well. Arthur's trial for Betty's murder began in January 2013. Over roughly 10 days, prosecutors laid out their case piece by piece: the blood in the garage, the failed woodpile alibi, the mismatched crash speed, the undisturbed coins, the blood soaked beneath Betty in the seat, and the eerily similar death of a first wife 9 years earlier. The defense fought back with its own blood pattern expert, who argued the evidence could still be consistent with an ordinary car accident, along with a medical report suggesting Betty's injuries were compatible with an unrestrained passenger in a collision. Arthur took the stand in his own defense. He turned his chair to speak directly to the jury, drawing on the same persuasive presence that had carried him through decades of sermons. It did not work. On the 22nd of January 2013, the jury convicted Arthur Schirmer of first-degree murder and evidence tampering. They deliberated for only about 90 minutes. One detective later said she considered Arthur one of the prosecution's best witnesses, because his own account of a violent crash was almost impossible to reconcile with the photographs sitting in front of the jury. The county's district attorney later recalled that Arthur told deputies after testifying that he believed he had effectively convicted himself. On the 18th of March, 2013, Arthur received life in prison without the possibility of parole for Betty's murder, plus an additional sentence for tampering with evidence. Jules' case was still open. In June 2014, facing overwhelming forensic evidence, Arthur entered a no-contest plea to third-degree murder in his first wife's death. On the 10th of September 2014, he was sentenced to 20 to 40 additional years, to run after his life sentence for Betty. He has never publicly confessed to killing either woman. His 3 children from his first marriage continue to insist their father is innocent. Betty's son and sisters have publicly thanked investigators for finally proving what they suspected from the very beginning, that Betty did not die by accident. She was murdered by the man she trusted most. What ultimately convicted Arthur Schirmer was never a confession or an eyewitness. It was physical evidence that contradicted his own story at almost every turn. Crash reconstruction placed the real speed of the vehicle at somewhere between 15 and 25 miles an hour, roughly a third of the speed Arthur claimed. The car remained fully drivable afterward. No airbags deployed. There were no meaningful skid marks. That mismatch alone told investigators the crash could not explain Betty's catastrophic head trauma. The blood evidence sealed it. Blood had soaked into the seat cushion beneath Betty in a pattern consistent with her already bleeding before she was placed there, not an injury she sustained upright during impact. The trail of blood in the garage, confirmed through DNA testing, led directly toward where the car had been parked. Because Betty was cremated within days of her death, a traditional autopsy was never possible. Instead, Dr. Wayne Ross reconstructed her injuries using CT scans, surgical records, and crash photographs, building 3-dimensional models of her skull trauma. He then compared those wounds to Jules' original autopsy from 9 years earlier, and found the 2 patterns strikingly similar, roughly 14 separate impact points on Jules' head alone. It is worth being precise here. Many retellings of this case claim Arthur used a crowbar. No specific weapon was ever recovered and scientifically matched to either woman's injuries. What investigators and forensic experts actually concluded was that the weapon was likely a long, cylindrical object, something like a crowbar or a length of pipe, not that one was ever definitively identified. There has never been a public psychological evaluation of Arthur Schirmer, so none of this amounts to a diagnosis. But the pattern documented across 2 decades is worth sitting with. Arthur built his entire adult identity around being instinctively trusted. a pastor's authority, a singer's warmth, a counselor's calm, and across 2 separate deaths, 2 separate decades, multiple witnesses described the exact same unsettling detail. He appeared strikingly unemotional at the precise moments other people expect visible panic or grief. That alone proves nothing. But paired with the documented pattern of infidelity in both marriages and a willingness to change his story only once confronted with hard evidence, rather than volunteering the truth, it paints the portrait of a man far more concerned with controlling the narrative than with the people inside it. Consider the sequence of his own explanations. He did not offer the woodpile story voluntarily. He denied there was ever blood in the garage first, and only produced an alternate explanation once he understood investigators already had proof. Denial, followed by a convenient story only after being confronted with evidence, is a pattern far more associated with damage control than an innocent man simply refreshing his memory. Respectability was never incidental to what Arthur Schirmer did. It was the exact mechanism that allowed it to happen twice. Arthur Schirmer is currently serving life without parole, plus 20 to 40 additional years, for the murders of 2 women who trusted him completely. If this case pulled you in the way it pulled us in, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss next week's deep dive, drop a like to support the channel, and tell us in the comments which detail in this case disturbed you the most. This has been Buried Truth Crime. Stay safe out there.